Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening as the stars begin their silent procession across the infinite dome? Cale, the quietest resident of the sprawling city, did not seek the din of the marketplace or the hurried applause of the academy. His sanctuary was the small, dust-moted workshop where the scent of oiled cedar mingled with the cold tang of hammered copper and the faint, earthy aroma of spent charcoal. He was a man obsessed not with what existed, but with how things moved, meticulously tracing the invisible lines of necessity that bound the grand gears of the cosmos to the simple lever he held in his hand, seeking the underlying truth in every pivot and weight. His contemporaries often misunderstood his long silences, mistaking deep contemplation for idleness, unaware that he was simply listening for the rhythm of truth beneath the clamor of everyday life, believing that true invention was merely the mechanical articulation of nature's perfect principles. This was known generally as the Age of Discovery, but for Cale, it was specifically the age of precise listening and careful imitation. Cale's most persistent and intellectually frustrating struggle was with the recognized imperfection of time itself. Specifically, the persistent inability of the city's grandest public timepiece, the massive water clock known as the clepsydra, to keep pace with the true, unwavering movement of the celestial spheres. Though marvelous in size, the great clock suffered acutely from inconsistent water flow, marking the hours unevenly and growing increasingly inaccurate as the pressure in the massive reservoir fluctuated wildly with the changing seasons and the varying draw of the population for irrigation and daily use. The most esteemed scholars argued this persistent disparity was an inevitable limitation, citing the inherent and natural capriciousness of the water elemental itself. But Cale resolutely refused to accept that the immutable, constant principles governing the stars could not also be made to govern a simple stream within a bronze vessel. He held the unwavering philosophical conviction that if the heavens moved with such flawless, measured grace, then human ingenuity, when properly applied and harmonized with nature, possessed the ability to echo that very perfection here on Earth. One humid afternoon, while observing a humble mill wheel turning against a strong and inconsistent river current, Cale experienced a profound flash of realization that the error lay not merely in the supply or the volume of the water, but fundamentally in the unregulated release. He deduced that the mechanism desperately needed a powerful, self-adjusting regulator, a device that would impose a constant, measured resistance, ensuring that whether the central reservoir was overflowing or nearly exhausted, the rate of water egress would remain perfectly steady, a mechanical echo of unchanging principle. He began to envision a complex and beautiful assembly composed of floating brass vanes and delicately weighted counterbalances, designed to rise and fall precisely with the water level, dynamically and instantly restricting the outflow aperture only just enough to maintain the perfect pressure. This was far more than merely adjusting a pipe. It was an ambitious attempt to instill the profound philosophical concept of cosmic constancy directly into a working piece of worldly machinery. For many arduous months thereafter, the quiet, rhythmic tapping of Cale's small, specialized hammer was the only discernible sound heard late into the nights, as he meticulously crafted the necessary delicate components out of fine brass and hardened steel, filing them down to tolerances thinner than a sheet of the finest parchment. He chose the most precious alloys available, polishing every surface until the metal reflected the flickering flame of his simple oil lamp like countless small, captive suns, understanding implicitly that the slightest bit of friction or sloppy execution would fundamentally defeat the entire purpose of his quest for perfect design. His hands, though naturally rough from years of heavy labor and heat, moved with the extraordinary precision of a senior scholar drawing a complex celestial chart. handling each fragile pivot, linkage, and gear as if it were a fragile truth newly discovered and brought forth from the surrounding darkness. He knew with certainty that the success of his revolutionary device hinged entirely upon the perfect, unwavering harmony of these myriad small pieces, each one performing its silent, minuscule duty in service of the grand, steady, and desired flow of time. But the carefully regulated stream of water did not falter. As the reservoir level inevitably dropped throughout the long day, the weighted brass vanes subtly and smoothly shifted their position, dynamically narrowing the outflow aperture just precisely enough, maintaining the exact prescribed pressure against the escaping stream. When the evening bells eventually rang out, marking the passage of the 12th hour, the water clock had successfully proven its constancy, matching the solar time exactly, hour after hour, a stunning mechanical testament to applied philosophical and mathematical principle. The senior engineers, who had emphatically come to scoff at the humble inventor, now stood in astonished silence, recognizing that Kyle had not simply repaired a faulty machine, but had demonstrated a deeper, profound mastery over the very elements, forcing the liquid chaos into the disciplined service of celestial order. This singular and elegant invention transcended mere utility. It was rightly recognized as a poem written in gleaming brass and flowing water, a beautiful, tangible celebration of the inherent reliability of the underlying universe. The quiet, profound success of Kyle's innovative regulator rippled outward with unforeseen force, far beyond the immediate mechanics of mere timekeeping, inspiring a completely new and exciting wave of philosophical thought among the city's esteemed scholars and philosophers. They began to understand clearly that the true and lasting power of human invention lay not in the creation of entirely new and unnatural things, but rather in the patient, insightful observation of the natural laws and the careful crafting of precision devices that allowed those very laws to express themselves perfectly, without human interference or destructive deviation. Kyle himself remained entirely unchanged by the sudden surge of widespread attention, quickly returning to the silent solitude of his workshop to begin intensely contemplating the next great physical puzzle, the seemingly impossible possibility of conveying crucial messages across vast geographical distances without relying upon the slow passage of runner or the unreliable flight of bird. He was now intensely searching for the physical medium that silently carried the elusive pulse of sound, attempting to harness, capture, and then dramatically amplify that fleeting acoustic energy. The transmission of voice over great distance presented a challenge that was far greater and more conceptually difficult than the successful control of water, for sound seemed fundamentally immaterial, an ephemeral vibration of the air that quickly dissipated and died almost immediately after utterance. Kale spent many laborious weeks studying the profound echo in deep natural caverns and meticulously observing the peculiar way that the smallest whispered sound could travel clearly and coherently through a long, tightly stretched length of cord, eventually theorizing that the energy of the spoken voice could perhaps be contained and channeled if the container itself was perfectly rigid, dense, and highly reflective. Based on this theory, he began intensive experimentation with long, meticulously hollow tubes crafted from highly polished silver and dense copper, believing that the metal's inherent density and exceptional interior smoothness might successfully capture the fragile sound wave and effectively guide it along its interior path, much like light is known to reflect and travel within a perfectly cut crystal. His first attempts using straight, fixed tubes proved successful only over minimal distances, as the acoustic energy still seemed to leak or weaken at every joint and bend in the construction, disappointing Kale but confirming his central hypothesis. The loss was not intrinsic to the sound itself, but to the imperfection of the containing vessel. He soon realized that for practical, long-distance communication across the uneven terrain of the city, the tube would need to be articulated and flexible, yet maintain its smooth interior continuity without interruption. This necessity led him to the inventive, complex design of interlocking spherical collars, each precisely fitted and polished, allowing the tube to bend gently while preventing any significant gap or roughness in the sound-carrying passage. This invention of the flexible conduit was a mechanical marvel in itself, requiring an unprecedented level of metallurgical precision to execute successfully. Cale employed a team of skilled apprentices who, under his meticulous instruction, spent over a year constructing the vast system, laying the intricate, snake-like tubing beneath the city streets, linking the highest observatory with the lower maritime port, a distance previously requiring a swift runner nearly an hour to traverse. When the system was finally completed, Cale stood at the observation end, instructed his chief apprentice, Farron, positioned miles away at the port, to whisper the single word, Astra, and held a carefully designed bronze receptor funnel to his ear. The moment of truth was heavy with expectation, not only for the delivery of the message, but for the philosophical validation that even the most fleeting of energies could be captured, contained, and mastered by human design. The sound that finally reached Cale's ear was faint, thin, and slightly metallic, yet unmistakably clear. Astra. He paused, a slow, profound smile crossing his lips, not just because the word was transmitted, but because the fidelity of the sound confirmed that the acoustic wave had traveled the entire distance without collapsing into mere atmospheric vibration. This proved that sound, like water or shadow, was a force governed by specific, predictable principles, capable of being engineered, channeled, and controlled, fundamentally changing the human perception of space and time. The city instantly recognized the profound military and commercial implications of the "whispering line," as it was soon dubbed. But Cale saw only the successful demonstration of yet another hidden structure of the universe revealed through meticulous craftsmanship. Following these mechanical successes, the philosopher in Kyle turned his contemplative gaze towards the greatest unseen force of the physical world, the wind, and the possibility of utilizing its immense, untamed energy for lifting heavy burdens without relying on animal strength or human toil. He was troubled by the difficulty of constructing the great pyramids and temples of the past, seeing the reliance on brute force as a crude solution, a mechanical failure that did not harmonize with the natural abundance of power readily available in the atmosphere. He began to draw designs for massive, adjustable sails and intricate gearing systems, meant not for maritime travel, but for permanent installation upon high towers, intended solely to convert lateral wind movement into rotational lifting power. Cale's initial blueprints focused on the principle of the helical vein, arguing that a flat blade merely pushes the air, but a curved spiral vein can efficiently catch the wind from nearly any direction, converting a broader spectrum of atmospheric movement into focused, usable torque. This required a deep understanding of fluid dynamics, treating the air not as empty space, but as a tangible, flowing medium, dense enough to be harnessed and directed by cleverly shaped surfaces. The sheer size of the proposed wind-lifting machine, meant to stand hundreds of feet high, presented immense structural challenges, demanding materials strong enough to withstand the most violent gales without collapsing under their own weight or the relentless pressure of the harnessed wind. He commissioned the forging of special iron alloys, tempered in the fires of volcanic ash, to achieve an unprecedented hardness and resilience, alloys that were required for the gigantic axle and the primary gearing system designed to translate the slow, powerful rotation of the massive vanes into the swift, controlled vertical ascent of a weighted platform. The construction site, soon known as the Tower of Aeolus, became a magnet for both the curious and the skeptical, who stood far back, watching the careful, slow erection of the gargantuan framework against the often empty backdrop of the sky. This endeavor was deemed Kael's most audacious folly yet, a physical challenge to the established order of labor, implying that the gods meant for man to work with less strain and greater efficiency. When the final helical vein, a massive structure of oiled timber and metal ribs spanning the width of 2 chariots, was hoisted into place, the entire city held its breath, awaiting the first true test of the immense machine. Kael, standing calmly at the base, waited only for a moderate breeze, disdaining the use of a gale for the initial operation, preferring a gentle demonstration of consistent power over a display of terrifying brute force. As the soft wind began to catch the meticulously angled vanes, the enormous central axle began to groan slightly, then smoothly turned, initiating the rotation of the complex gearing system with a deep, resonating hum. The noise of the mechanism was unlike anything previously heard in the city, a sound of immense, slow power. A grinding rhythm that spoke of tons of material moving against friction, yet moving easily, almost gracefully, under the silent command of the wind. With minimal effort applied to the release lever, a platform carrying 5,000 pounds of dressed stone, a load that would typically require 20 straining oxen, began its slow, steady ascent towards the top of the structure, lifting the burden effortlessly towards the sky. The crowd did not cheer immediately. Instead, they watched in stunned, quiet disbelief, observing the natural force of the unseen wind performing the labor of dozens of men and animals, a spectacle that instantly redefined the possibilities of human mechanical endeavor. The Tower of Aeolus did more than simply lift stones. It instantly and forever changed the nature of manual labor within the city, freeing countless shoulders from the yoke of constant, crushing toil and allowing many to pursue trades requiring intellect and precision rather than sheer physical endurance. The philosophical implication was clear. The ultimate purpose of invention was not to create luxury, but to alleviate unnecessary suffering and to afford humanity the time and energy needed for higher contemplation and civic improvement. Kael saw this release of human potential as the true measure of his success, recognizing that the clever arrangement of metal and timber had purchased countless hours of freedom for his fellow citizens. However, the rapid succession of Kael's revolutionary inventions, the perfect clock, the whispering line, and now the wind lifter, soon drew the unwelcome attention of the established orders who held economic and political power through the control of human resources. The chief foreman of the stonemasons' guild, whose livelihood depended on charging high rates for brute force and coordination, viewed the Tower of Aeolus not as a blessing, but as a direct, dangerous threat to his entire economic structure. Whispers began circulating among the less enlightened that Kael was not simply a master craftsman, but a practitioner of forbidden arts, an artificer who drew his unnatural powers directly from the unpredictable spirit world of the air and the water. Kael, ever focused on the elegance of mechanical truth, largely ignored these escalating rumors, dismissing them as the inevitable noise created by those who feared the inevitable march of progress and the redistribution of labor. Yet the pressure mounted, reaching a peak when the High Council summoned him to the Grand Chamber, not to honor his ingenuity, but to demand a full, detailed accounting of the forces he was manipulating, insisting that his work dangerously bordered on challenging the authority of the very elements themselves. They argued with solemn faces that if man could so easily harness the wind and channel the voice, then where would the necessary awe and reverence for the uncontrollable forces of nature be found? Kael stood calmly before the assembled council, presenting not philosophical arguments, but the precise, polished diagrams of his devices, showing the complex interplay of levers, gears, and calculated resistances. He explained, with quiet clarity, that he controlled no elemental force. Rather, he merely created structures that allowed those forces to express their inherent, natural tendency toward predictable movement, channeling energy that was otherwise wasted and diffused. His inventions, he argued, were acts of reverence, demonstrating the perfect logic placed within the world by the divine order, revealing the profound truth that every force, even the wildness of the wind, possessed a comprehensible pattern, if only one possessed the vision and precision to find it. The council, composed mostly of landed aristocrats and merchants accustomed to transactions rather than physics, struggled to grasp the profound elegance of his defense. Yet they could not deny the immense, undeniable utility of his machines, nor the overwhelming public benefit they provided. They reluctantly conceded his freedom to continue his work, but only under the stern condition that he must immediately turn his inventive genius away from matters of war, defense, or the creation of any new device that could potentially disrupt the fundamental social hierarchy of the city. Cale simply bowed, already thinking not of war, but of the gentle problem of artificial light, pondering how to create illumination that did not consume precious oil or require constant tending. He recognized that the need for constantly tended flames represented another form of human servitude to the physical world, a nightly constraint on the time and resources of the populace, tying their lives to the cycle of gathering fuel and trimming wicks. Cale began to explore the strange properties of certain polished stones and treated minerals that seemed to hold the faint memory of sunlight, releasing a gentle, non-combustible glow in the darkness. His goal was not to replicate the fierce intensity of fire, which was useful for heat and cooking, but to provide a soft, constant, ambient luminescence sufficient for reading or navigating the household without danger or expense. This quest for cold light led him to the alchemist's chambers and the deepest mines, where certain phosphorus-bearing compounds lay hidden within the earth, materials that seemed to absorb the daytime light with a strange, lasting eagerness. Cale spent months painstakingly refining these crude minerals into a fine, translucent paste, experimenting with different binders, tree sap, whale oil, resin, seeking the perfect medium that would allow the material to be applied to a surface, charge fully during the day, and release its captured energy slowly throughout the entire night. This demanded patience far exceeding his previous mechanical projects, requiring slow, chemical observation rather than immediate mechanical feedback. Eventually, he perfected a thin, sticky resin mixed with the treated mineral dust, a mixture that, when painted thinly onto ceramic tiles, offered a gentle, ethereal green-blue radiance after sundown, a light that seemed to emanate directly from the substance itself, divorced from flame or heat. These glowing tiles were quickly installed along dangerous thoroughfares and within the city's great halls, illuminating steps and pathways with a spectral, constant glow that required absolutely no tending or consumption of resources. It was a silent, peaceful invention that banished the most treacherous shadows of the night, offering security and efficiency through stored light, once again proving that nature offered resources far beyond the surface if one only knew how to unlock their potential. The city, now regulated by perfect time, connected by invisible voices, lifted by the wind, and guided by stored sunlight, entered a new era of prosperity and quiet efficiency, demonstrating that the Age of Invention was not marked by noise or conquest, but by the thoughtful, steady application of universal principles. Cale, retiring deeper into the silence of his workshop, simply observed the illuminated city from afar, recognizing that his greatest invention was not any single machine, but the subtle, profound shift he had initiated in the philosophical relationship between humanity and the reliable, ordered world around it. His final project was one that had no practical utility, but held immense symbolic value. A tiny, perfectly constructed mechanical bird, wrought from silver wire and feather-thin bronze, designed to fly solely by the power of a finely coiled spring and the shifting currents of warm air rising from the city. He spent years tuning the miniature gears, adjusting the weight, and perfecting the curve of the wings, seeking to create a living testament to the possibility of flight, driven by pure mechanism and observation of avian aerodynamics. He viewed this final, unnecessary creation as the purest expression of the inventor's soul, the joy of making something beautiful and free simply because it could be done. When the final calibration was complete and the air above the workshops grew still and promising, Cale ascended to the highest, quietest tower overlooking the vast, slumbering city. He carefully placed the tiny silver bird upon the smooth, cool stone of the balustrade, its delicate bronze wings shimmering faintly under the soft, distant lamps powered by stored earthlight, casting long, thin shadows that danced in the invisible current. He felt no nervousness, only a profound sense of peaceful closure, knowing that if this fragile machine could master the invisible currents of the atmosphere, it was a confirmation of every principle he had ever patiently relied upon throughout his long life of study. He wound the minute spring with measured, ancient care, feeling the deep tension build within the core of the automaton, releasing the latent energy that held the promise of a brief and silent soaring above the city he had silently perfected. With a silent, almost imperceptible release, the mechanical bird lifted feather light from his fingertip, catching the subtle thermal draft that rose from the orderly concentration of warm city stone and brick below, circling gracefully upward in the cool night air. It did not fly with the direct purpose of the messenger pigeons or the heavy, utilitarian flight of the cargo kites, but simply to exist in the atmosphere, a fleeting, metallic grace, visible only against the deep sapphire canvas of the night sky. Cale remained motionless, watching until the silver speck was almost entirely swallowed by the darkness above the highest roofs, understanding clearly that true mastery of a physical force meant allowing it to express its inherent freedom rather than forcing it into immediate and heavy servitude. The silence of the machine's flight spoke louder than the calculated din of any factory or the triumphant proclamation of any council, proclaiming the profound elegance inherent in precision and the potential of non-aggressive engineering. Below, in the soft twilight of the waking city, a few isolated souls observed the strange, miraculous apparition, a silent, soaring creature that moved with impossible lightness above the tallest domes and the newly erected wind harps. The devout stargazers who watched the predictable march of the celestial sphere and the early bakers who stoked the regulated furnaces paused their work, pointing silently to the zenith, unable to place this phenomenon in the common categories of bird or bat or errant fire-lit lantern. Word spread slowly, whispered through the city's quiet, regulated passages, describing a miracle of silver and shadow that flew without effort and without apparent purpose, save the transcendent beauty of its own impossible existence. This inexplicable aerial wonder became known throughout the populace simply as the Weaver of Air, a fleeting yet enduring symbol of the city's technical mastery over the unseen forces, yet distinct entirely from the predictable, essential utility of their ordered daily lives. One particularly learned scribe, known for his relentless and methodical recording of Cale's practical innovations, the deep earth lights, the communication harmonics, and the robust wind-harnessing towers, found himself grappling profoundly with the mechanical bird's resolute uselessness. He realized, after weeks spent in quiet contemplation beneath the rhythmic tick of the city's main clock, that the lights served the body's need for sight. The towers served the hearth's need for warmth, but the silver bird was meant only to serve the soaring, unfettered spirit of humanity itself. This final, gratuitous creation was Kael's testament that the greatest achievement of the methodical, ingenious mind was not ultimately to conquer the natural world, but rather to perfectly mirror its subtle, self-sustaining harmony in miniature, a spiritual echo in fine metal. The scribe carefully etched this difficult yet illuminating realization onto the finest parchment, marking the philosophical transition from the age of calculated utility to the nascent age of humble contemplation. Having launched his final, silent message into the vast, indifferent atmosphere, Kael formally closed and sealed the large public doors to the sprawling areas of his once busy workshop, keeping only a small, sun-drenched study open to the light and the quiet, comforting hum of his highly accurate internal clockwork mechanisms. His long days were now spent not in the arduous labor of inventing new devices, but purely in the restful act of systematic observation. He would sit for hours watching the tiny, flawless brass gears of his own personal timepieces turning in rhythmic, unwavering perpetuity, finding profound solace in their unwavering, predictable consistency. He understood clearly that true and final rest was not found in the cessation of all activity, but rather in witnessing the elegant, ordered continuance of systems that had been set into perfect, self-maintaining motion long ago, requiring no further, agitated intervention from their original conceiver. His once roaring, restless mind, which had served for decades as a furnace of ceaseless possibility, became instead a still, cool pool reflecting the organized, unchanging heavens above. The thriving, magnificent city, accustomed for so long to relying utterly upon the steady, guiding hand of its quiet genius, now looked upon his profound public silence and disappearance with a complex mixture of respectful awe and a faint yet wholly productive anxiety concerning the future. The citizens did not surrender to panic, for the operational systems he had built were inherently robust and designed to be self-sustaining for generations. But they instantly recognized the deep and abiding need to preserve and codify the comprehensive knowledge that had originally birthed such deep-seated reliability. Therefore, the Grand Council immediately decreed the establishment of the Lyceum of Applied Philosophy and Mechanism, an institution dedicated entirely to the systematic study and replication of Kael's disciplined, patient approach to the universal laws of nature. The focus of the scholars was not merely on what he painstakingly built, but fundamentally on how he had learned to think, ensuring that the methodical, patient search for underlying universal truths would never vanish with one great man's intentional, quiet retirement. Therefore, the Grand Council immediately decreed the establishment of the Lyceum of Applied Philosophy and Mechanism, an institution dedicated entirely to the systematic study and replication of Kael's disciplined, patient approach to the universal laws of nature. The focus of the scholars was not merely on what he painstakingly built, but fundamentally on how he had learned to think, ensuring that the methodical, patient search for underlying universal truths would never vanish with one great man's intentional, quiet retirement. Within the cool, meticulously crafted stone halls of the new Lyceum, young students were taught first and foremost to revere the stillness of focused observation above the transient excitement of instant, erratic discovery or flashy result. They spent entire academic seasons studying the intricate ratios of Kael's subtle airfoils and the calculated, precise tension of his flawless clockwork springs, gradually learning that the most profound and far-reaching insights often lay frustratingly hidden within the minutest adjustments and the most meticulous, careful material selections. Their newly adopted institutional motto became the profound decree, "The principle endures," a sober recognition that true, lasting invention was merely the systematic uncovering of eternal, pre-existing laws, not the arrogant, capricious creation of something entirely novel and unheard of. They utilized the city's perfect rhythmic timing mechanism, ensuring that every single experiment and measurement was conducted with an identical, measured precision, thereby patiently removing all traces of chaotic human error and arbitrary judgment from the equation of discovery. They utilized the city's perfect rhythmic timing mechanism, ensuring that every single experiment and measurement was conducted with an identical, measured precision, thereby patiently removing all traces of chaotic human error and arbitrary judgment from the equation of discovery. The perfect, universally agreed-upon time, disseminated constantly from the central governing tower, thus became much more than a mere tool for regulated commerce or bureaucratic efficiency. It transformed subtly into the steady, unwavering metronome of the entire society's collective, ordered existence. Festivals began and ended on the precise, unwavering chime. Complex agricultural cycles were monitored to the exact minute of the clockwork rotation, and even the daily rituals of rest, familial gathering, and private meditation were synchronized across the whole vast city populace. This shared, unwavering temporal rhythm fostered an unexpected, deep sense of collective peace, entirely eliminating the inherent stress and the chaotic friction that inevitably came from individual, unreliable, and imprecise reckoning of the passage of the hours. The citizens felt securely bound not by arbitrary, shouted decrees from governors, but by the quiet, unifying pulse of the precise cosmos as interpreted flawlessly by Kale's utterly reliable mechanism, weaving them all into a singular, harmonized, and productive community. Months later, after having drifted far beyond the designated city limits and the known trading routes on the high and visible paths of the upper winds, the silent silver bird finally yielded gently to the slow, steady attrition of the atmosphere, its finely coiled internal spring having finally exhausted the last of its latent potential energy. It descended without fanfare or noise, landing not amidst the noisy, chaotic market squares or the busy dockyards, but gently and softly in the sheltered, walled garden of the Lyceum, resting next to an ancient, weathered sundial that had been crafted centuries before. The attending students found the object not as a failed or broken machine, but rather as a returned, significant traveler, a perfect physical symbol demonstrating the ephemeral quality of even the most perfect, finely wrought mechanism when set against the relentless and persistent nature of the colossal natural forces. They reverently enshrined the miniature bird, recognizing that its completion marked not the ultimate, definitive end of all invention, but rather the essential, vital beginning of deep, philosophical maintenance and quiet, profound appreciation for the perfect, enduring systems already gracefully gifted to them by the world. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? When Kale heard the tidings of his silver messenger's gentle and natural return, he did not race to the Lyceum in a panic of proprietary concern or engineering dismay, but paused in his quiet, dust-filled workshop, observing the low arc of the afternoon sun upon his polished workbench, feeling the heavy stillness settle around him. He understood instantly that the cessation of the miniature bird's intricate, tireless motion was not a flaw or a failure of his meticulous design, but the inevitable and graceful fulfillment of its original, finite, inherent purpose. For any mechanism drawing upon a strictly measured reserve of finite energy must, by the unbending, perfect cosmic law, eventually cease its working. The profound, essential difference between the mechanical invention and the living, immortal soul, he mused deeply, was that the machine, however perfect in its initial construction and flawless in its execution, was bound entirely by the constraints of its beginning and its initial winding, whereas the resilient human spirit perpetually drew upon an inexhaustible spiritual source of potential renewal found only within continuous striving and the boundless halls of shared memory. He journeyed to the walled, sheltered garden, not to hurriedly reclaim the polished, silent artifact as if it were simply a lost tool, but rather to pay his silent, thoughtful homage to the place of its hard-earned rest, a true pilgrim visiting a sacred, significant location. There, upon the low pedestal of worn gray stone, rested his highly polished, shimmering creation, its thousands of interlocking gears now utterly motionless and profoundly silent, lying directly beside the ancient, simple bronze stylus of the massive sundial that had stood guard over the garden for centuries. This stark, compelling juxtaposition struck him with a silent, humbling force, revealing how the sundial, relying on nothing more than the perfect, ceaseless orbit of the Earth and the pure, unfailing, honest light of the sun, represented a simple truth far deeper and less mutable than his own painstaking, labored calculation and intricate winding, reminding him sharply that the greatest of human works merely reflect, they do not truly create, the majestic, enduring order already established in the distant heavens. The sundial's patient shadow measured time through pure, unimpeded observation, an effortless dance of light, while his bird measured it through meticulous, wound-up artifice. And yet, both artifacts told the same unwavering story of relentless, purposeful forward passage. The young scholars soon approached him with great, quiet reverence, their hands still lightly dusted with the fine white chalk and the faint, coppery bronze shavings of their own modest, fledgling mechanical attempts. And one, perhaps bolder and more intellectually restless than the rest, posed the essential, core question of the eternal idealist. "Master Kale," the young man began with a respectful tremor in his voice, "since you have divined the perfect ratio and the flawless, strongest spring known to man, why not now simply design a self-winding mechanism, a true perpetuum mobile, to draw energy eternally from the ambient air or the vibration of the earth itself, so that your great work never, ever yields to natural attrition and never falls silent?" Kale smiled gently then, a wise, warm look that conveyed great understanding of their intellectual thirst, but deeper, profound appreciation for nature's beautiful, unyielding limits, patiently explaining that the search for truly perpetual motion was the most beautiful, seductive, and ultimately futile of human delusions, as it fundamentally misunderstood the sacred, dual nature of energy itself, which demands absolute equilibrium and profound, necessary rest just as surely as it demands sudden release and vigorous motion. To seek endless, frantic action, he cautioned them softly, was not to honor the quiet perfection of the cosmos, but rather to childishly rebel against the fundamental, necessary rhythm of the great universal breath, the powerful, vital inhalation, and the inevitable, necessary, calming exhalation. "We have successfully measured time," Kyle stated, addressing the assembled Lyceum with a calm, resonant clarity that somehow carried further than any sudden shout or forceful decree, and found its mechanisms to be utterly reliable, precise, and completely predictable. But time itself is only the fleeting, ephemeral vessel, not the true, enduring substance of a worthy life. He formally announced his commitment to a new, entirely different endeavor, leaving behind the measurement of the external, measurable, predictable world that yields to the clockwork, and deliberately turning his focus inward to the far more challenging, yet infinitely more vital, task of measuring the inner qualities that resolutely resisted all mechanical accounting. He would now seek to quantify the uncoiled, subtle springs of human virtue, the deep, persistent pressure of collective memory, and the unseen, fluctuating atmospheric conditions of genuine societal health and consensus. His next generation of instruments, he declared firmly, would not tick or chime or swing a precise pendulum, but would seek instead to quantify the otherwise unquantifiable, tracing the subtle, invisible arcs of profound, steadfast loyalty and the deep, often unheard, seismic vibrations of fundamental communal truth. His next generation of instruments, he declared firmly, would not tick or chime or swing a precise pendulum, but would seek instead to quantify the otherwise unquantifiable, tracing the subtle, invisible arcs of profound, steadfast loyalty and the deep, often unheard, seismic vibrations of fundamental communal truth. His first new philosophical instrument, born of this profound shift in purpose, took shape not as a delicate, intricate clockwork mechanism comprised of microscopic brass components, but rather as a robust, beautifully simple resonator made of perfectly aged, dark cedar wood and tightly strung wires of pure, untarnished silver, which he named the Harmonicon Civitas. This curious new device possessed absolutely no internal moving parts, nor did it require winding, but was designed instead to measure the duration and clarity of a shared acoustic phenomenon. When a significant founding historical passage or a binding foundational civic oath was spoken directly near it with genuine feeling, the instrument would dutifully hold the resulting vibration or echo within its taut silver strings, allowing the resonance to decay slowly and naturally over time. The swiftness with which this foundational vibration dissipated was, Cale deeply posited, the true, honest measure of the collective spiritual alignment of the listening citizens. A rapid, abrupt decay indicating deep societal discord or widespread spiritual forgetfulness, while a long, slow sustained echo suggested deep, integrated civic memory and robust, enduring communal belief. The quiet introduction of the Harmonicon Civitas caused a great, unsettling stir among the city magistrates and regional governors, who had become entirely accustomed to governing by arbitrary fiat and the loud, arbitrary shouting of momentary policy, finding all their sense of necessary stability only in the strict, measurable adherence to Kyle's previous, old mechanical time, marked by his perfect clockwork bird. Now they were suddenly and gently forced to consider a new, subtle, and profoundly challenging metric of true leadership. Not merely when to decisively command or execute a task, but rather how deeply the populace remembered the foundational, unspoken principles upon which their very lives and shared community were built. Governing became less an exhausting exercise in relentless scheduling and more an enlightened art of steady, historical narrative and quiet, consistent example. Recognizing finally that the long-term, unshakable stability of the entire city rested not upon the flawless perfection of its detailed laws, nor the strength of its armies, but entirely upon the enduring, continuous strength of its shared internal echo, resonating continuously through the passing generations like the slow, quiet, predictable tide beneath the polished shore stones. Cale spent the next 7 seasons traveling not as a celebrated inventor carrying magnificent, intricate mechanisms, but as a subtle, unassuming philosopher carrying the robust cedar harmonicon, moving slowly from one established trading city to the next coastal settlement, introducing his profound instrument to temples, senates, and grand market squares, patiently demonstrating its silent function to anyone who would listen with an open mind and a receptive spirit. In cities where avarice and immediate, selfish gain had eclipsed the memory of foundational sacrifice and honest effort, the silver strings of the device fell swiftly and immediately silent, failing to hold any echo beyond a fleeting moment, proving that the citizens there were effectively deafened to their own past counsel and lived only in the anxious, demanding present. Conversely, in the oldest, most settled communities, those renowned not for wealth but for unwavering fairness and deep tradition, the strings would hum gently for nearly half the day after the invocation of a simple, forgotten law of common dignity, testifying powerfully to the deep spiritual health and robust self-regulating civic architecture built upon continuous living memory. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking shelter from the evening wind and respite from the demanding day? The profound and sometimes frightening consequence of Cale's unique demonstration was that his instrument became widely understood as an impartial, unerring arbiter of civic integrity, a judge made of wood and silver that could not be bribed or coerced. And this reputation naturally began to precede him. As Cale approached a new metropolis, the magistrates and powerful trading guilds would often grow strangely quiet and anxious, suddenly consumed by the fear that their long-hidden, habitual corruption would be irrevocably exposed before the eyes of their subordinates and the general populace. They learned swiftly that the Harmonicon possessed no political loyalty. It simply revealed the underlying spiritual decay, leaving no doubt that a silence that falls too quickly is a direct testament to the community's shared indifference to the sacred, founding contract between the ruler and the ruled. News of this uncanny device eventually traveled faster than Cale himself, carried not by dusty scrolls or official couriers, but by the swift and reliable currents of common whisper and market gossip, detailing how the ancient cedar box measured the moral distance between what a city proclaimed itself to be and what it had truly become. This rising notoriety soon compelled the interest of those who sought to maintain power through careful artifice rather than genuine merit, particularly the secretive Archon Council of Galt, a sprawling mercantile capital built upon sheer economic velocity rather than any venerable tradition. Galt was a place where memory was considered a hindrance to quick profit, and where the past was ruthlessly paved over to make way for the next immediate scheme of enrichment. Cale knew, as he approached the high obsidian walls of Galt, that this city would serve as the ultimate crucible for his instrument, for if the Harmonicon remained silent here, its message would be dismissed as merely quaint philosophy, but if it spoke truly, it would issue a powerful and dangerous indictment against the very structure of the commercialized state. The Archon of Galt, a stern and perpetually anxious man named Tyrion, had already heard rumors of the device's unsettling ability to expose spiritual poverty, and he immediately dispatched his most trusted guards to escort Cale, not as an honored guest, but as a potential political saboteur carrying a mysterious weapon. Tyrion had no interest in civic virtue, but immense concern regarding any mechanism that might shift the allegiance of the heavily taxed, weary common citizenry. Upon arrival, Cale was taken directly to the massive, tiered Senate House, where the Archon and his inner circle sat in judging silence, their faces shadowed by the vast carved ceiling beams that symbolized their authority, waiting to scrutinize the traveler and his unsettling wooden box. Tyrion spoke first, his voice sharp and dismissive, asserting that a healthy civilization was measured only by the height of its treasury and the reach of its influence, declaring any concept of shared memory to be nothing more than the sentimental drivel of aging poets. He demanded that Cale immediately explain the mechanism and reveal its purpose, warning him severely against any attempt to incite civic unrest or disseminate damaging falsehoods within the walls of Galt. Cale responded with calm dignity, placing the robust cedar harmonicon gently upon the polished stone table before the assembly, explaining slowly that the device was merely a finely tuned receptor, designed to listen for the faint but necessary resonance of long-ago commitment still echoing within the present moment. He assured them that the instrument did not create the truth, but simply reflected the presence or absence of the foundational integrity upon which all laws and all stable prosperity must eternally rest. He then drew a single clean note from the silver strings, letting the profound silence settle upon the heavy air of the Senate. To conduct the test, Kale chose to invoke the first law set down by the founders of Galt, a noble but long-ignored edict requiring that 10% of all city revenue must be perpetually set aside to aid the families of dock workers and quarrymen who were injured or lost during the difficult, necessary labor of building the city's massive infrastructure. This law, still officially written in the ancient charter but utterly forgotten in practice, represented the core sacrificial exchange: protection for labor, security for diligence. The moment Kale recited the venerable text, demanding that the Senate recall and honor that simple, foundational pact of mutual obligation, a profound stillness fell over the room. The silence that followed was terrifying and immediate, far more devastating than any Kale had ever witnessed in the smaller, openly corrupt towns along the coast. The silver strings of the harmonicon did not merely fade, they snapped back into absolute silence almost instantaneously, failing to produce even the slightest lingering whisper or humming resonance, proving utterly and demonstrably that the shared memory of that critical, compassionate law had been entirely purged from the collective consciousness of those who governed. The very air in the chamber seemed to grow thin, a chilling testament to the total spiritual exhaustion and self-serving amnesia that currently characterized the leadership of Galt. A palpable wave of apprehension and fury swept through the Senate tiers, for the Archon and his council immediately understood that Kale had not presented a philosophical treatise, but rather a direct, undeniable condemnation of their current rule, performed openly for the few scribes and witnesses allowed into the chamber. Tyrion, his face growing hard and pale, slammed his fist upon the table, declaring the device to be a wicked, fraudulent mechanism powered by illicit arts designed solely to spread sedition among the honorable citizens of the Commonwealth. He immediately ordered Kale's arrest, demanding that the harmonicon be confiscated and swiftly destroyed, lest its dangerous message be allowed to circulate beyond the Senate walls. Kale did not resist the physical restraints of the guards who moved toward him, but he looked steadily at Tyrion, his eyes clear and resolute, and spoke one final, measured pronouncement before they could drag him away toward the dungeon complex beneath the Senate House. He calmly explained that seizing the physical cedar box was a foolish and vain effort, for the true power of the harmonicon lay not in its carved wood or its intricate strings, but entirely within the indisputable fact of the immediate silence it had just produced, a truth that had been witnessed by many, recorded by the scribes, and could now never be entirely recalled or destroyed. The evidence of Galt's sickness was already abroad in the world, released upon the air by the test itself. Though they confiscated the harmonicon and carefully began the methodical process of dismantling it piece by piece in search of hidden spells or secret mechanisms, Tyrion and his men found only wood, tension strings, and finely worked brass, nothing that explained its uncanny function. This failure only deepened the Archon's anxiety, as he realized that Kyle was indeed correct. The device was merely a mirror, and the flaw lay not in the mirror itself, but in the diseased face gazing back at it. Kyle was quickly hustled out of Galt in the deepest hour of the night, not imprisoned, but exiled under immediate pain of death, escorted by guards who were specifically ordered to ensure he left the city territory without ever speaking to a single citizen again. As Kyle passed through the vast, cold outer gates of Galt, now heading south towards the quieter, mountainous kingdoms, he took comfort in the knowledge that while rulers often possess the might to destroy the mirror, they forever lack the power to erase the flaw that the mirror revealed. He realized that the greatest invention was not the harmonicon itself, but the undeniable, replicable method of testing the spiritual health of a government, an act which now became a subtle, powerful tool that no archon could entirely control or silence, and one which would continue to challenge established authority wherever memory was consciously allowed to lapse into convenient oblivion. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The mountain road ascended sharply, demanding a focused breath and a slow, steady gait that mirrored the necessary patience for deep understanding, granting Kyle a meditative solitude he could never have achieved within Galt's oppressive walls. He carried only a traveler's cloak and a satchel of notebooks, finding profound freedom in the absence of the heavy brass and complicated mechanisms he had recently possessed, realizing that his most crucial possessions were now merely his memory and his relentless dedication to logical thought. He knew that the weight of the Archon's temporary judgment was a fleeting sound that would quickly fade against the eternal silence of the peaks, whereas the truth he had uncovered possessed the immutable weight of the very stone around him. Weeks later, following trails known only to shepherds and the most devout hermits, Kale found refuge in the small, independent principality of Aethel, high in the fractured spine of the world, where scholars sought not wealth or power, but the perfect, uninterrupted quiet required for contemplation. The monastic residents here understood the intrinsic value of silence and deep listening, recognizing that true wisdom was often merely the faint echo of a long-forgotten truth, and they offered Kale a simple, sparsely furnished cell carved into the mountainside. Here, away from the grinding political clamor of the centralized city-states, he was granted the safety and freedom required to pursue his terrifying arithmetic and philosophical refinement without fear of the magistrate's swift decree. He began the second, far greater task, which was to translate the singular, physical manifestation of the harmonicon into a timeless, universally accessible written philosophy that required no costly materials or difficult construction. Kell knew that physical instruments could be destroyed, but ideas, once perfectly articulated and committed to memory, could not be burned or exiled, for they resided in the very architecture of shared human thought. He spent the long, cold nights detailing precisely how societal strain, moral compromise, and the slow, insidious creep of institutional denial could manifest as palpable dissonance and noise in the collective soul of a civilization. He called his new manuscript the Compendium of Resonant Governance, explaining that the strings of the harmonicon were never meant to judge, but merely to measure the tensile strain already inherent in the social fabric and the integrity of the ruling contract. Kale argued that any truly resilient system of governance must possess a sensitive, self-correcting mechanism, much like the finely tuned escapement of a master clock, lest its temporal machinery drift irrevocably toward chaotic cacophony and eventual collapse. He posited that the test he had invented was not an instrument of rebellion, but a necessary diagnostic tool for long-term stability, designed to whisper essential warnings to the responsible stewards before the internal tensions required a destructive shout to be released. Though Kyle himself remained sequestered, the initial, startling story of the Archon's terror and the resulting exile of the inventor could not be fully suppressed, spreading rapidly along the established trade routes and through the encampments of traveling scholars and skeptical poets. Merchants recounted the strange tale in distant taverns, speaking of the enormous instrument that measured the guilt of the city, transforming Kyle's invention from a scientific principle into a powerful, almost mythological concept, a spiritual litmus test for those who held the levers of power. The very notion of a machine that could objectively assess the truth of governmental pronouncements became a chilling thought experiment, discussed quietly in academic courtyards and whispered nervously between trusted members of administrative councils far beyond Galt's borders. The very notion of a machine that could objectively assess the truth of governmental pronouncements became a chilling thought experiment, discussed quietly in academic courtyards and whispered nervously between trusted members of administrative councils far beyond Galt's borders. In the great marketplace of Meros, known for its ingenious artisans and relentless competition, several ambitious engineers attempted immediately to replicate Cale's feat, hoping to achieve fame or fortune by capturing the mysterious power of the harmonican's silence. They diligently constructed massive wooden frames and stretched countless wires of copper and iron, attaching complicated bellows and gears in the mistaken belief that the complexity of the machine was the key to its resonant power. However, these crude copies produced only loud, predictable noise, a hideous, unmodulated clangor that reflected only the confusion and hubris of their own making, utterly failing to achieve the subtle, haunting silence that Cale's instrument had once momentarily released. They fundamentally misunderstood that the harmonicon had achieved its silence not by adding complexity, but by perfectly isolating and neutralizing the vibrations that were already not present in the city's heart, a condition achievable only when the structure and the spirit were perfectly aligned. The replicating inventors focused entirely on the mechanism of the test, ignoring the crucial philosophical understanding that Kyle possessed. The instrument was only a passive receptor, and the true invention was the intellectual method of interpreting the absence of sound, not the creation of new sound. Kyle, Hai, and Ethel received reports of these failures with a quiet sadness, realizing that his greatest challenge was not overcoming tyrants, but educating those who confused elaborate craftsmanship with fundamental truth. Meanwhile, back in the closed city of Galt, Archon Tyrion found no peace, despite having dismantled and archived the original harmonicon in the deepest vault beneath the citadel, guarded by men sworn to absolute secrecy. The memory of the resonant silence was more persistent than any physical instrument, breeding a profound and corrosive paranoia among the ruling council, forcing them to self-censor their decisions and second-guess their public pronouncements. Every administrative failure, every instance of public unrest was now measured against the invisible metric of the harmonicon, confirming to the Archon that Cale's true power lay not in the invention itself, but in the unforgettable, undeniable fear of being truly measured. Tyrion dispatched loyal agents to scour the south, not to capture Cale, which would only turn the inventor into a martyr, but to locate and confiscate every single page of the rumored Compendium of Resonant Governance before it could be copied or distributed. He understood that a physical device required skilled construction and resources, but a well-written doctrine explaining the methodology of measuring spiritual decline could travel unbound, carried solely by the power of conviction, rendering the entire concept of the harmonicon ubiquitous and impossible to defeat through force alone. The Archon thus became inadvertently devoted to preserving the silence, not the silence of truth, but the silence born of suppressing the very words that defined the flaw. Cale, now completing the central tenets of his manuscript, realized that his exile had been a gift, forcing him to refine his ideas into a durable form that could withstand the inevitable political storms. He wrote of how true vigilance was required not over the populace, but over the stewards themselves. For the greatest corruptions are born of small, comfortable compromises accepted daily until they coalesce into a deafening roar of injustice. He understood that while the physical harmonicon had tested the city of Galt once, the compendium would provide the method for every conscientious citizen in any state to perpetually test the spiritual foundations of their own government, whenever and wherever they chose to listen deeply to the sounds that the state labored so tirelessly to suppress. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? From where do you join us this evening? Cale spent the next moon in meticulous preparation, realizing that the survival of the ideas did not rely on a single pristine manuscript, but on many imperfect fragments scattered across the known world, like seeds entrusted to the wind, destined to sprout far from the shadow of Galt. He employed 3 separate layers of concealment, translating the essential chapters not only into the common tongue, but into the numerical language used by traveling merchants and the coded poetry recited by wandering minstrels, knowing that true suppression fails when the carrier does not even recognize the vital cargo they bear. He chose to entrust the physical copies to those whose lives were already defined by movement and anonymity, ensuring that the roots of the harmonican's philosophy would be planted far beyond the immediate reach of Galt's oppressive walls, where the Archon's writ held undisputed sway over the fearful populace. Foremost among these trusted couriers was Silas, a quiet man known throughout the southern trade routes for his unrivaled skill in navigating the perilous mountain passes and for his unnerving ability to disappear into any shadow, traits born not of stealth training but of a profound spiritual humility that rendered him invisible to the arrogant gaze of authority. Silas understood the danger immediately, recognizing that holding the compendium was akin to carrying a lamp in the deepest mine, attracting both the gaze of those who desperately sought the light and the inevitable wrath of those who feared the slightest tremor of illumination that might reveal their own dark dealings. Cale spoke not of rebellion or revolution, but simply of listening, urging Silas only to deliver the pages to established scholars and hermits who already possessed the deep capacity for self-reflection, those whose existing integrity would allow the words to resonate without distortion or violent misinterpretation. As they stood at the edge of the wilderness, watching the first blush of dawn paint the eastern peaks, Cale handed Silas the leather-bound scrolls, emphasizing that the physical harmonicon device was merely a tool, a bell whose ringing could easily be silenced by the brute force of a hammer or an iron chain. He explained that a resonant idea, however, could endure torture, fire, and decades of bitter exile, because it did not reside in the fragile flesh of the inventor or the costly brass of the machine, but found its true sanctuary deep within the unshakable chambers of the human mind, becoming truly immortal once it was fully understood and acted upon. Silas bowed deeply, understanding that his journey was not merely transportation, but the sacred duty of delivering an intellectual spark that might ignite the necessary vigilance of a new age, a burden heavier and more perilous than any physical gold he had ever agreed to carry through the dangerous passes. Meanwhile, the Archon's search accelerated into a brutal, comprehensive sweep, fueled by the terrifying realization that his initial attempt to hunt down the device had been utterly short-sighted, believing the threat to be merely mechanical rather than philosophical. The Archon, now driven by a cold, calculating fear rather than blind rage, authorized the sealing of all major library archives, the intense interrogation of every known printer and papermaker, and the public burning of any text that even vaguely alluded to concepts of self-governance or the measurement of state morality, mistakenly believing that by destroying related ideas, he might somehow incinerate the compendium itself. His agents moved across the city like a creeping blight, tearing through the intellectual lifeblood of Galt, replacing measured discourse with the stark silence of absolute, unquestioning compliance, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with suspicion and mutual distrust among once friendly neighbors. The breakthrough, or rather the catastrophe, arrived when a low-level border guard, bribed with meager copper coins and the promise of a promotion, reported the exchange of unusual scrolls bearing unfamiliar, complex philosophical notation passed between a wandering hermit and a merchant near the desolate southern mountain pass. Though the guard could not read the text, the description of the fine, heavy paper and the distinct, dense handwriting matched the profiles distributed by the Archon's Central Command, suggesting that the document was neither a common prayer nor a trade ledger, but something infinitely more valuable and hazardous to the stability of the realm. The Archon received this news in the deep stillness of the palace's private chambers, and the realization that the words had already fled Galt's sealed territory caused a sharp tremor of cold panic to seize him, confirming that his careful plans had been circumvented by the simplicity of a solitary man and a shared scroll of deadly knowledge. He immediately summoned his most loyal inquisitor, Commander Valerius, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by his complete absence of personal morality, and issued a direct, unequivocal order. Abandon the costly, time-consuming search for the physical harmonicon device, and instead hunt down every single person who had touched the compendium, prioritizing the retrieval of the original text above all other concerns. The Archon instructed Valerius that the machine was merely a loud noise in the street that could be ignored or muffled by propaganda, but the word was a corrosive acid capable of eating away the very foundations of loyalty and obedience from within the minds of the people, requiring total excision before it could spread further than the reach of their cavalry. Valerius, understanding the gravity of hunting an invisible intellectual plague, immediately mobilized the elite royal trackers, shifting the focus from simple physical surveillance to the interception and meticulous analysis of all written correspondence, seeking any pattern of unusual phrasing or unexplained philosophical inquiry that might betray the presence of Kale's destabilizing teachings in the wider world beyond Galt. Valerius, understanding the gravity of hunting an invisible intellectual plague, immediately mobilized the elite royal trackers, shifting the focus from simple physical surveillance to the interception and meticulous analysis of all written correspondence, seeking any pattern of unusual phrasing or unexplained philosophical inquiry that might betray the presence of Kale's destabilizing teachings in the wider world beyond Galt. Silas, traversing the high, treacherous mountain roads toward the free territories of the East, felt the palpable pressure of the pursuit like a growing, unnatural wind pressing against his back, though he had seen no agent of Galt's Archon for many long days. He meticulously concealed the precious compendium within a false bottom of his saddlebag, underneath mundane items like dried salted meats, spare leather repair kits, and humble wool blankets, knowing that conspicuous secrecy was often far more dangerous than skillfully blending the extraordinary with the utterly ordinary. He often stopped at night to study the pages by the meager, flickering light of his traveler's lamp, not seeking to master the complex mathematics of resonance, but rather to internalize Kael's core ethical lesson, that power, unchecked by vigilant self-awareness, always decays into tyranny, a fundamental truth that gave him the spiritual fortitude necessary to continue his impossibly dangerous errand. The first copies of the translated chapters passed in whispers and coded gestures between those who distrusted centralized power, began to surface subtly among communities far removed from Galt's immediate influence, particularly among independent artisan guilds and isolated monastic orders who prized philosophical independence above material wealth. These initial readers were not equipped or inclined to build the complex brass harmonicon itself, but they immediately grasped Kale's central principle that societal corruption registered as an unavoidable dissonance, a failure of harmony between the stated laws and the lived experience of the citizenry, suggesting that truth was indeed audible if only one dared to listen beyond the official, reassuring pronouncements. The concept, once planted, took root quickly, offering a potent intellectual framework for the vague anxieties and moral uncertainties that had been accumulating silently beneath the polished, tyrannical surface of the era's most powerful states, turning passive discomfort into active, reasoned suspicion among the intellectual class. The Archon, receiving fragmented reports of this burgeoning intellectual agitation from distant provinces, tales of scholars debating the audible morality of their local governors and questioning the historical justification of taxation, began to realize the terrifying scope of his fundamental failure, recognizing that the compendium was spreading like uncontrollable wildfire through the very channels he could neither monitor nor effectively control. He had always relied upon high walls, disciplined guards, and physical instruments of immediate control to maintain the fragile order of his rule. Yet Cale's ideas moved on the breath of men, impervious to siege engines, immune to the sharp edge of the executioner's axe, requiring a level of thought control that even the most repressive regimes found impossible to maintain effectively across vast territories. The true dread was not that the people would rise up violently in rebellion, but that they would simply cease to believe in the absolute, divine necessity of his rule, rendering his legions and his overflowing treasury fundamentally meaningless in the face of widespread, reasoned intellectual skepticism. The true dread was not that the people would rise up violently in rebellion, but that they would simply cease to believe in the absolute, divine necessity of his rule, rendering his legions and his overflowing treasury fundamentally meaningless in the face of widespread, reasoned intellectual skepticism. Commander Valerius, seeing the sheer hopelessness of hunting every fragmented, imperfect manuscript, focused his immense resources instead on identifying Kael's primary distribution network, theorizing correctly that the inventor must have relied on one or two exceptionally skilled couriers to carry the bulk of the initial, complete text out of the besieged city. Valerius utilized Gaut's vast and highly intrusive network of customs inspectors and toll collectors, gathering detailed records of every traveler who had passed through the southern gates in the weeks immediately following Kael's forced exile, meticulously charting anomalous journeys, discrepancies in travel papers, and individuals whose reported destination bore no logical relation to their established trade. The hunt thus narrowed rapidly, centering eventually upon the quiet, almost undetectable movements of Silas, the humble courier whose very obscurity had initially shielded him, but whose unmatched efficiency now painted him clearly as the central artery of the intellectual contagion that threatened the very life of the state.